You know what's wild? When most people think about World War II, they picture soldiers charging beaches, tanks rolling through smoke, flags being raised or torn down. But almost nobody stops to think about the people who weren't holding weapons at all. The people who woke up every single day just trying to stay alive in a world that had completely lost its mind. Because while history talks about battles and generals, the real war was happening in kitchens with no food, in bedrooms shaking from bombs, and in the quiet panic of families realizing their street might be gone by morning. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Civilians weren't just caught in the middle of World War II. They were targeted, uprooted, starved, silenced, and forced to grow up overnight. And if that sounds intense, good, because it was. If you've ever wondered what war actually feels like when you don't get a uniform, when you don't get training, when you don't get a choice, this is the side of the story you have probably never been shown. And the reason this matters is simple. Once you see World War II through the eyes of ordinary people, children, mothers, neighbors, families, the entire war changes. It stops being history and starts feeling uncomfortably real. So stay with me, because we're about to step beyond the front lines, into the ruins, the silence, the survival, and the lives that carried the weight of the deadliest war in human history without ever firing a single shot. When we talk about World War II, we almost always talk about it from far away, from maps, from battle plans, from the sky looking down at arrows moving across continents. But the truth is, that's not where most people experience the war at all. For millions of civilians, the war didn't begin with a declaration or a marching army. It began when the walls of their homes started shaking, when the sound of engines overhead meant you grabbed your children instead of your belongings, when the place you felt safest suddenly became the most dangerous place to be. There were no front lines for ordinary people, because the front line could be anywhere. Your street, your school, your kitchen table. And one day you're arguing about chores or dinner, and the next day you're learning how fast you can run when the sirens go off. This is the part of World War II that rarely gets center stage because it's harder to measure and harder to romanticize. But it's the reality most people live through. A war fought not with weapons, but with endurance. Imagine being a child who learns the sound of bombs before learning long division, or a parent who has to decide whether to stay inside and risk collapse, or run outside and risk being seen, or a family that measures time not by calendars anymore, but by air raids, food lines, and quiet moments when nothing explodes. That's what we mean when we say beyond the front lines. Because for civilians, there was no clear beginning and no clear end, just a slow, relentless pressure that turned everyday life into a survival test. And once you start looking at the war from this angle, everything changes. Because World War II stops being a story about armies winning and losing and starts being a story about ordinary people holding their lives together while the world around them falls apart. To really understand what civilians went through in World War II, you have to understand one big shift that changed everything. This was the first war where the battlefield didn't stay on the battlefield. In earlier wars, if you were a civilian, the fighting usually happened somewhere else, far away from your town, far away from your family. But in World War II, that distance disappeared. War came home, literally. Cities became targets, factories became targets, neighborhoods became targets, and suddenly being a civilian didn't mean being safe anymore. It just meant being unarmed. Planes didn't care if a building was a military base or an apartment block. Bombs didn't stop to ask who lived inside, and entire cities learned that the sky itself could turn against them without warning. Governments called this a total war, but for ordinary people, it just meant that life and danger were now inseparable, that even staying home was a risk, and leaving home might be even worse. What made this even harder was that there was no off switch. The war wasn't something you watched on the news or heard about from letters. It controlled your schedule, your sleep, your meals, and your decisions. Sirens decided when you ran. Blackout curtains decided when you could turn on a light. Ration cards decided how much you could eat. And none of this happened once or twice. It happened over and over again, day after day, until it became normal. And that's the part people don't always talk about. Civilians weren't living in constant action like a movie scene. They were living in constant anticipation, waiting for the next raid, the next shortage, the next knock on the door, never fully relaxed, never fully safe. Imagine trying to raise kids, fall in love, celebrate birthdays, or grieve losses in a world where everything could change in a single night, because that's what war comes home really meant. And this wasn't just one country or one city. This was happening across Europe and Asia at the same time, in different ways but with the same result. Whether you lived under bombing, occupation, blockade, or invasion, the message was the same. This war had no sidelines. Civilians weren't watching history unfold. They were trapped inside it. Once you understand that, it becomes clear that World War II wasn't just fought by soldiers. It was survived by ordinary people who had no training, no armor, and no choice, yet still found ways to keep going in a world that suddenly made everyday life the most dangerous thing of all. Once the war settled into people's lives, danger stopped feeling like a dramatic moment and started feeling like a routine. And that might be the hardest thing to imagine today. For civilians, fear wasn't something that came and went. It was something you planned around. You didn't wake up asking what you wanted to do that day. You woke up asking what you were allowed to do, what was safe enough to risk, and how fast you could move if everything suddenly went wrong. Air raid sirens became part of the daily soundscape, so familiar that people learned to tell how serious the danger was just by how they echoed through the streets. Blackout rules meant you couldn't even turn on a light at night without risking attention from above. So windows were covered, rooms stayed dim, and cities went dark in ways we can barely imagine now. Even sleep wasn't really sleep anymore. It was more like resting with one groin ear open, always ready to jump up, grab a coat, grab a child, and run. What's important to understand is that people still had to live their lives inside all of this. Kids still woke up in the morning. Parents still tried to cook meals. People still went to work if there was work to go to, but everything happened under this invisible countdown clock. You might be standing in line for bread while scanning the sky, or walking to school knowing you might not make it home the same way. Bomb shelters weren't dramatic hideouts. They were cramped, dark, overcrowded spaces where strangers sat shoulder to shoulder in silence, listening to the world shake above them, trying not to think about what might be gone when they came back out. And then, once it was safe, you didn't get closure or comfort. You just went back upstairs, swept up glass, checked who was still alive, and prepared to do it all over again the next day. Over time, something strange happened. People adapted, not because it got easier, but because they had no choice. Fear became background noise. Kids learned which streets had the fastest access to shelters. Families kept emergency bags by the door without even talking about it. People memorized escape routes the way we memorize phone passwords today. That's what daily life under constant threat that really looked like. Not nonstop screaming or chaos, but a quiet, exhausting awareness that danger could drop out of the sky at any moment. And once you understand that this wasn't a rare experience, but a repeated one, shared by millions of ordinary people, you start to see World War II differently. Not as a series of battles, but as a long stretch of days where simply surviving until tomorrow felt like an accomplishment worth celebrating. Now here's where the war really starts to creep into the most basic part of being human: eating. Because once danger becomes routine, the next question is simple. Okay, but what do we live on? And for civilians during World War II, hunger wasn't always a dramatic, movie-style moment where someone collapses in the street. It was usually quieter than that, more constant, more exhausting. It was the feeling of never being fully full, of waking up already thinking about food, of stretching a meal the way you stretch a paycheck when you know the month is longer than your money. And the crazy part is, hunger didn't just mean less food. It meant life turning into math. How many slices can we cut this into? How many days can we make this last? How much can the kids eat today without leaving nothing for tomorrow? Rationing is the big word people throw around, but let's make it simple. Rationing was basically the government saying, we don't have enough, so everyone gets a limited amount. That meant you couldn't just walk into a store and buy what you wanted, even if you had money. because the shelves were often empty, and even when they weren't, you needed the right ration cards or coupons. Butter, sugar, meat, bread, fuel, everything became controlled, measured, and restricted. And for families, especially in cities, the day-to-day challenge wasn't just cooking dinner. It was finding dinner in the first place. People stood in long lines for hours not knowing if there'd be anything left by the time they reached the front. And imagine how brutal that is when you have got kids at home waiting, or when the weather's freezing, or when the city's been bombed and normal supply routes are broken. And when there isn't enough, people get creative, fast. Families learned how to make meals out of whatever they could get. Soups that were mostly water, bread stretched with fillers, tiny scraps turned into something that could at least warm your stomach. People saved everything. Nothing got thrown away. Vegetable peels, bones, stale bread, anything that could become calories became valuable. Bartering exploded because money didn't always help anymore. People traded whatever they had, clothes, tools, family heirlooms, for food. And if you had access to a small patch of land, even a tiny backyard, growing food became survival, not a hobby. A few potatoes or carrots could mean the difference between getting through a hard week or not. But here's the part that hits the hardest. Hunger forces choices. Not theoretical choices, man, real ones. Do you eat now or save it for later? Do you give the biggest portion to the child who's still growing, or to the adult who has to work all day to keep the family afloat? Do you risk going out to search for food during danger, or stay inside and accept what little you have? In some places, these decisions weren't rare. They were daily. And that's why hunger during World War II wasn't just a physical thing, it was psychological too. It changed people's priorities, their routines, even their relationships. Because when food is uncertain, everything else becomes secondary. You stop thinking about the future the way you normally would, and you start thinking in smaller units of time. One more day, one more meal, one more night. And if you really want to understand what civilians endured, don't picture grand speeches or dramatic battles for a second. Picture a parent staring at a nearly empty kitchen, trying to turn not enough into something that keeps everyone alive, and doing it again tomorrow and the next day and the next. That's survival. That's the war at home. And the scariest part? For a lot of families, this wasn't happening for a week or a month. It was happening for years. And this is where the war cuts especially deep, because when you look at it through the eyes of children, everything feels even more upside down. Childhood is supposed to be the one phase of life where danger feels distant, where someone else is responsible for keeping you safe. But during World War II, that illusion didn't exist. For millions of kids, the war didn't interrupt childhood for a moment. It rewrote it completely. Playgrounds turned into rubble. Classrooms shut down or moved underground. Toys were replaced with responsibilities, and games were replaced with rules about survival. Kids learned very quickly when to stay quiet, where to hide, and how to read adults' faces for signs of danger, because in a world like that, awareness mattered more than innocence. What's hard to grasp today is how fast children had to grow up, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Some children walked miles to find food or water. Others helped care for younger siblings while parents worked, hid, or simply disappeared. School, when it happened at all, became irregular and fragile, something that could vanish overnight after a bombing or an occupation order. And even when lessons continued, they were taught in cold rooms, damaged buildings, or makeshift shelters, with the understanding that learning might stop at any moment if sirens went off. Imagine trying to memorize multiplication tables while listening for aircraft, or trying to read a book knowing the building might not be there tomorrow. And emotionally, kids carried far more than we give them credit for. They saw things they weren't supposed to see, destroyed homes, injured neighbors, grieving adults, and they absorbed it quietly because that's what survival demanded. Many learned not to ask questions, not to complain, not to cry too loudly. They understood, even at a young age, that being good meant being low maintenance, not adding stress to already overwhelmed parents. Some children became messengers, helpers, or even caretakers, roles that forced them into adult thinking long before adulthood should ever arrive. And while adults often tried to shield them, there's only so much protection you can offer when the entire world feels unsafe. What makes this even more powerful is that these kids didn't stop being kids on the inside. They still wanted to laugh, play, and dream, but those moments were squeezed into the cracks between danger. A joke told in a shelter, a game invented out of rubble, a brief sense of normality before reality rushed back in. Childhood didn't disappear, but it was reshaped, hardened, and shortened. And for many, the effects lasted long after the war ended. Because when your earliest memories are tied to fear, hunger, and loss, you don't just go back to being a child when peace returns. That's what childhood interrupted really means. Not just lost years, but a generation that learned far too early how fragile life could be and carried that knowledge with them forever. And then there's another layer of civilian life that's even harder to explain unless you really slow down and picture it. What it meant to live under occupation, where the war wasn't just something that happened to you, but something that watched you. Occupation didn't always mean constant explosions or open violence. A lot of the time, it meant rules, control, and a kind of fear that settled deep into everyday life. Curfews told you when you could exist outside your own home. New laws appeared overnight, often written in languages people didn't even speak. Armed soldiers walked streets that used to feel familiar, and suddenly your neighborhood didn't belong to you anymore. People learned very quickly that saying the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time could have consequences. So silence became a survival skill. Conversations got shorter. Trust became fragile. Even neighbors you'd known your whole life could feel like a risk, not because they were bad people, but because desperation and fear change how people behave. What made occupation especially suffocating was the constant sense of being watched. Homes could be searched without warning. Papers could be demanded at random. A knock at the door could mean anything, from questioning to arrest to never being seen again. And that uncertainty is what really wore people down. Parents taught their children what not to say before teaching them what to say. People avoided eye contact, avoided gathering in groups, avoided drawing attention to themselves in any way. And while history often talks about resistance movements, and those stories matter, it's just as important to understand that for most civilians, survival meant keeping your head down, blending in, and making it through another day without becoming a target. That doesn't make people weak or complicit. It makes them human in a situation where one mistake could cost everything. And the silence wasn't just outside, it followed people inside their own homes. Families whispered. Radios were hidden or listened to quietly. Opinions were kept private, even among loved ones, because you never knew who might overhear or repeat something without realizing the danger. Fear didn't need to announce itself loudly. It lived in pauses, in careful wording, in decisions not to ask questions. Over time, that kind of pressure changes people. It teaches them to measure every word, to think twice before trusting, to treat quiet as safety. And that's what occupation really did to civilian life. It didn't just control territory, it reshaped behavior, relationships, and even thoughts. For many people, the war wasn't just something they endured physically, it was something they learned to carry silently, day after day, until silence itself became the safest way to survive. And this is the part of civilian life during World War II that often goes unnoticed, because people back then didn't even have the words for it yet. Today, we talk about trauma, stress, anxiety, and mental health. Like they're understood things, but during the war, none of that language really existed for ordinary people. What civilians were experiencing didn't come with a diagnosis or support. It just became part of who they were. People didn't say they were traumatized. They said they were tired or jumpy or that they couldn't sleep anymore. They didn't talk about panic attacks. They talked about nerves. And because everyone around them was dealing with something similar, it all felt strangely normal, even though it absolutely wasn't. Imagine living for years in a state where your body never fully relaxes, where sudden noises make your heart race, where silence feels just as dangerous as sound. Many civilians developed habits that never went away. Sleeping lightly, keeping shoes by the bed, flinching at loud bangs long after the war ended. Nightmares were common, but people rarely spoke about them because there was no space to. The expectation was simple. survive first, deal with everything else later. And later often never came. Life moved on, cities were rebuilt, governments changed, but inside people's minds, the war kept replaying itself in fragments, especially during quiet moments when there was nothing left to distract them. What made this even heavier was the lack of understanding or acknowledgement. There were no counselors waiting when the fighting stopped, no widespread conversations about emotional recovery. Many civilians were expected to be grateful. Grateful they survived, grateful the war was over. And that made talking about lasting fear or sadness feel selfish, even inappropriate. So people stayed quiet. They pushed through. They raised families, went back to work, and rebuilt their lives while carrying invisible wounds that never fully healed. Children grew up watching adults who were distant, overly cautious, or emotionally closed off, without realizing that these behaviors were shaped by years of constant danger and loss. And here's the key thing to understand. Trauma doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. For many civilians, the war ended on paper, but their bodies and minds didn't get the memo. They lived with a constant sense of alertness, a deep fear of instability, and a belief that safety could vanish at any moment, because that's exactly what had happened before. This wasn't weakness, and it wasn't failure. It was the human response to prolonged fear without relief. That's why this part of the civilian experience matters so much, because it reminds us that the true cost of war isn't only measured in casualties or destroyed buildings, but in the quiet, lasting impact it leaves on people who had no name for what they were carrying, yet carried it anyway for the rest of their lives. When the war finally ended, people expected the world to snap back into place, like flipping a switch from chaos to normal. But that's not how it worked, not even close. For civilians, the end of fighting didn't mean the end of struggle. It just meant the struggle changed shape. Bombs stopped falling, but cities were still broken. Streets were familiar and unrecognizable at the same time, lined with ruins where homes, shops, and memories used to be. Families stepped outside expecting relief and instead found silence, debris, and a future that suddenly felt wide open and terrifying all at once. Peace didn't arrive as celebration for everyone. It arrived as a question. Okay, now what? One of the hardest parts was realizing that survival didn't automatically bring closure. People came home to houses that no longer existed or to doors that opened into emptiness. Many searched for loved ones who never returned, not knowing whether to hope or grieve. Displacement was everywhere. Millions of civilians were refugees in their own countries, moving through landscapes that felt foreign even though they'd grown up there. Food was still scarce, jobs were uncertain, and rebuilding wasn't just about bricks and roads. It was about figuring out how to live without the people, routines, and sense of safety that once defined everyday life. The war might have ended on a specific date, but its effects didn't respect timelines. And emotionally, there was no reset button. Civilians were expected to move forward quickly, to be grateful that the worst was over, but many were still stuck in survival mode. After years of constant danger, peace felt strange, almost suspicious. Loud noises still triggered fear. Sudden changes still felt threatening. Some people struggled to enjoy calm moments because they'd learned over and over again that calm never lasted. The world wanted to rebuild fast, but inside, many civilians were exhausted in ways that weren't visible. They carried grief for those they lost, guilt for surviving when others didn't, and confusion about who they were now that the version of life they'd known before the war was gone. What makes this moment so important is that it reminds us the end of war isn't the end of its consequences. For civilians, rebuilding wasn't just physical, it was deeply personal. It meant learning how to trust stability again, how to plan for the future without expecting it to collapse, how to raise children in a world that no longer felt predictable. Some managed it slowly, others carried the weight quietly for decades, but almost no one walked away untouched. And that's the truth we often skip over when we talk about victory and peace. For ordinary people, the war didn't end when the fighting stopped. It echoed forward into everyday life, shaping how they loved, how they feared, and how they understood the fragile idea of normal from that moment on. And this is where everything comes together, because once you've walked through the war from the perspective of civilians, it becomes impossible to see World War II the same way again. Battles, dates, and strategies still matter, but they stop being the whole story. Civilian experiences remind us that history isn't just shaped by people in power, it's endured by people with no power at all, people who didn't choose the war but had to live inside it anyway. When we listen to these stories, the war stops being something abstract or distant and becomes something deeply human, something that happened to real families who woke up every morning hoping nothing would go wrong that day. These aren't side stories or footnotes. They're the backbone of what the war actually was for most of the world. Civilian stories matter because they show us the true cost of war, not just in numbers, but in everyday life. They show us how fear becomes routine, how hunger reshapes priorities, how childhood can be shortened, and how silence can become a form of survival. They explain why entire generations carried caution, resilience, and anxiety long after the fighting ended, and why the effects of war don't disappear just because peace is declared. When we ignore these stories, we risk turning war into something clean and distant, something that feels almost manageable or necessary on paper. But when we include them, war becomes harder to romanticize and easier to understand for what it really is, a force that reaches far beyond soldiers and battlefields. And there's something else that makes these stories matter today. They help us recognize patterns. They remind us that whenever civilians are treated as acceptable losses, history's repeating itself. The people in these stories weren't heroes in the traditional sense, but they were extraordinary in the quietest way possible. They adapted, endured, and kept going when there was no clear reward for doing so. They raised families in chaos, found moments of humanity in destruction, and carried memories that shaped the world long after the war ended. By remembering them, we're not just honoring the past, we're learning how fragile normal life really is and how important it is to protect it. So when we talk about World War II through the eyes of civilians, we're not just telling a different version of the same story, we're telling the story that explains everything else. Because behind every victory, every defeat, every turning point, there were millions of ordinary people doing the hardest thing imaginable, surviving day by day in a world that had fallen apart. And once you truly see the war through their eyes, it stops being just history and starts feeling like a warning, a lesson, and a reminder of the human cost we can never afford to forget.